Clint Eastwood adjusted the brim of his hat as he stepped into the small, bustling diner just off a quiet street in Atlanta. The hum of conversation mingled with the faint clink of silverware, creating an oddly comforting symphony. He liked places like this, unassuming, grounded, and filled with the essence of real life. Clint's keen eyes scanned the room, taking in the weathered booths, faded menus, and the faint scent of coffee brewing behind the counter. For a man accustomed to glitz and glamour, this simple diner felt like a welcome escape. Then he saw her, Nina, a slender woman in her late 20s with tired eyes but a radiant smile, maneuvered gracefully between tables. Her name tag hung loosely from her uniform, slightly tilted, as if it had been hastily pinned on in the morning rush. Clint noticed how she greeted each customer with warmth, even though there was a weight in her step that betrayed her exhaustion. As she approached his table, he caught a glimpse of her hands, worn and calloused, a testament to a life that hadn't come easy. "Good afternoon, sir," she said with a polite nod, her voice carrying a melody of kindness. "What can I get started for you today?" Clint smiled, his iconic charm tempered by the simplicity of the moment. "Coffee, black," he replied, his voice as calm and steady as the man himself, "and whatever you'd recommend for someone who's had a long day." Her smile widened, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, you've come to the right place. Our homemade pot pie's a favorite. I'll get that going for you." As she turned to leave, Clint couldn't help but notice the way she paused for just a second, as if catching her breath. It wasn't the weariness of someone who hated their job. It was the quiet exhaustion of someone carrying more than their share of life's burdens. He watched her work, observing the way she treated every customer with the same respect and warmth. Whether it was the gruff construction worker in the corner or the elderly couple sharing a slice of pie, Nina made them all feel seen. Clint felt an inexplicable pull toward her, an urge to understand her story, to know what lay behind the tired eyes and that determined smile. When she returned with his order, Clint struck up a conversation. "You seem to know this place like the back of your hand," he remarked. She laughed softly, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "I've been here for 3 years now. It's not just work. Well, it's my second home." Her gaze flickered to the corner of the room, where a faded photograph of a little girl sat on the counter. "My daughter loves it here too. Says this place smells like pancakes and love." Clint chuckled, but his heart tightened at her words. He didn't press her further, but he couldn't ignore the pang of curiosity and compassion rising within him. There was more to her story. He could feel it, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he knew he needed to hear it. As the afternoon light filtered through the diner's windows, casting a golden glow over the room, Clint leaned back in his seat. This was no ordinary lunch stop. This moment, this place, and this woman, something about it all felt like the beginning of something profound. Clint Eastwood stirred his coffee slowly, his eyes drifting to the corner of the diner where the faint photograph of a little girl rested against a salt shaker. There was a warmth in Nina's voice when she'd mentioned her daughter, but it carried an undertone of quiet longing, as if love and sacrifice were inextricably woven into every syllable. He could sense there was more to her story than what her polite smile let on. Nina weaved through the tables again, her steps brisk but deliberate. Despite the warmth of the room, her hands felt cold. As she cleared a table near Clint, she caught his gaze lingering on the photo. She hesitated for a moment, then smiled faintly. "That's Ava, my little girl," she said, her voice soft but steady. "She's beautiful," Clint replied. His tone carried sincerity, making Nina pause. She wasn't used to being seen. Not like this, anyway. "Thank you," she said, carefully placing the tray on her hip. "She's my world. Everything I do is for her." Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Nina allowed herself to linger. Her usual instinct was to brush off personal questions to keep the focus on her work. But something about this man, his quiet demeanor, his steady gaze, felt safe. She exhaled softly and continued, her voice almost a whisper. "It's just the two of us now," she admitted, glancing at the photograph again. Her dad left when she was 2, said he wasn't ready to be a father. Clint's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He didn't interrupt, sensing the weight of her words. "I had to figure it all out on my own," she continued, her voice steady despite the emotion brimming beneath the surface. "I work 2 jobs, this diner during the day and cleaning offices at night. Ava doesn't know how hard it gets sometimes. She thinks I'm a superhero, calls me her Wonder Woman." She laughed softly, but her eyes glistened. Clint could feel the depth of her love for her daughter in every word. It wasn't just love. It was a fierce, unyielding commitment to giving Ava a better life, even at the expense of her own dreams. "Do you ever get time for yourself?" he asked gently. She shook her head with a faint smile. "I don't mind. Seeing her happy, hearing her play with that little keyboard I got her for Christmas, that's all I need. She wants to be a pianist one day. Says she's going to play at Carnegie Hall." There was pride in her voice, but Clint noticed the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the weight of unspoken fears. How to afford lessons, how to nurture a dream when the reality of survival loomed so large. Before Clint could respond, a loud clatter from the kitchen broke the moment. Nina excused herself, apologizing for the interruption. As she walked away, Clint leaned back in his seat, the weight of her story settling over him. In that instant, he saw her not just as a waitress, but as a warrior, fighting battles most couldn't see, fueled by a love so deep it defied the odds. Clint's fingers tapped the edge of his coffee cup, his mind already turning over the pieces of what he'd just learned. For a man who'd spent decades telling stories, he realized he was now part of one. And this story of quiet resilience and unyielding love, was already beginning to change him. Clint Eastwood sat in the corner booth, his coffee growing cold. He barely noticed. His mind was consumed by the story Nina had shared. Her words echoed in his thoughts. "Everything I do is for her." The strength in her voice, despite the weight of her struggles, struck him deeply. From where he sat, he observed Nina moving through the diner. She wasn't just working. She was holding this little world together. A smile here, a kind word there. She made every customer feel important. It was a skill, Clint realized, that came from understanding hardship. Only someone who knew pain could soothe it in others so effortlessly. He watched as she approached an elderly man sitting near the window, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to hold a spoon. Nina crouched beside him, her voice low and kind, offering to help. The man smiled, his gratitude evident, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause in that small act of humanity. Clint's gaze shifted to the photograph of Ava on the counter. It was a simple picture, Ava with a gap-toothed smile, holding a tiny toy keyboard, but it spoke volumes. It was clear Ava was Nina's anchor, her reason to push through exhaustion and keep going. Clint thought about his own life, the decades of fame and fortune, the crowds that adored him, and yet, in this small diner, watching this young woman's quiet resilience, he felt humbled. When Nina returned to his table, he decided to speak, not as Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood legend, but as a man who recognized strength when he saw it. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said, his voice soft but steady. She tilted her head, curious. "Oh? Someone from your family?" Clint smiled faintly, the memories surfacing. "My mother. She raised my sister and me on her own after my father passed. Worked long hours, sacrificed everything to make sure we had a chance. She had this fire in her, a quiet strength that kept us going no matter how tough it got." Nina's expression softened. "She sounds incredible." "She was," Clint said, his voice thick with emotion. "And so are you." Nina blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. "Me? I'm just trying to get by. Nothing special about that." Clint shook his head, his piercing gaze meeting hers. "You don't see it, do you? What you're doing, raising a child on your own, working 2 jobs, finding the time to care for strangers like that man by the window. That's extraordinary." Nina looked away, the compliment stirring something deep within her. She wasn't used to being seen like this, her efforts acknowledged so plainly. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Clint nodded, leaning back slightly. "You remind me of the kind of people this world needs more of, the kind who make it a little brighter, even when no one's looking." As Nina moved on to tend to another table, Clint felt an unexpected wave of inspiration. There was a story unfolding here, one of courage, love, and humanity, and he wasn't just a witness to it. For the first time in a long while, he felt compelled to do something meaningful. This wasn't just another stop on his journey. This was a moment that would stay with him, a quiet connection that would shape what came next. The diner bell jingled, its soft chime cutting through the low hum of conversation. Clint glanced up, his instincts sharp as ever, and noticed a man standing in the doorway. His clothes were worn, his hair unkempt, and his eyes darted around the room with a mixture of desperation and shame. He clutched a battered backpack to his chest, as though it were the last thing he owned in the world. The man hesitated, half turning as if ready to leave, but Nina noticed him before he could. "I'll be right back," she said to a customer, her voice calm and reassuring. Clint watched as she approached the man, her demeanor soft and inviting, like a beacon in a storm. "Hi there," she said gently. Looking for a seat? The man's eyes flicked to hers, filled with hesitation. I don't have any money, he mumbled, his voice hoarse. Nina didn't falter. She smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes, warm and genuine. That's okay. Everyone needs a good meal. Come on in, take a seat. Let me get you something hot. Clint straightened in his booth, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. He'd seen countless acts of kindness in his lifetime, but there was something about the ease with which Nina gave so freely, despite the weight she carried herself, that made his chest tighten. The man shuffled to a corner table, keeping his head low. Nina followed, bringing him a cup of coffee before returning to the counter to place an order. Clint noticed how she reached into her apron pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills, her tips for the day, and handed them to the cook with quiet instructions. Moments later, she returned to the man's table with a steaming plate of food. Here you go, she said softly. Take your time and let me know if you need anything else. The man looked up at her, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. Thank you, he whispered, his voice cracking. I don't know how to repay you. Nina crouched slightly to meet his gaze. You don't need to, she said, her tone firm but kind. Just take care of yourself, okay? And when you can, pass it on to someone else. Clint's grip on his coffee mug tightened. The simplicity of her words struck him. She wasn't just feeding a hungry man. She was giving him something far more valuable: dignity, hope, and a reminder that humanity still existed. As Nina moved on to another table, Clint reached for the small notebook he always carried with him. He flipped it open, his pen hovering for a moment before he began to write. The weight of what he'd witnessed settled over him, and a faint smile played on his lips. He looked back at the homeless man, who was eating slowly, savoring each bite. The diner buzzed around them, oblivious to the quiet miracle that had just unfolded. Clint's thoughts drifted to Nina. She had no idea what her actions meant, how far they might ripple, but Clint did, and he knew this was only the beginning. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting warm hues across the diner, the once busy rush began to fade. The clatter of dishes in the kitchen softened, and the hum of conversation dwindled to a murmur. Clint Eastwood had finished his meal, his plate pushed to the side, but he lingered. Something about this place, about Nina, kept him rooted there. Nina approached with a soft smile, holding the check for his meal. Thank you for stopping by today. It was a pleasure serving you, she said, her voice warm despite her visible fatigue. Clint leaned back slightly, his iconic calm demeanor intact. Instead of reaching for the check, he slipped a small envelope from his jacket pocket and placed it gently on the table. His weathered hands lingered on it for just a moment before sliding it toward her. I've already taken care of the bill, he said, his voice steady but layered with something deeper. This is for you. Don't open it until after I leave. Nina stared at the envelope, her brows knitting together in confusion. Sir, that's not necessary. You've already been more than kind. Clint held her gaze, his expression unyielding, yet kind. Sometimes kindness deserves to be returned. Humor me, won't you? Reluctantly, Nina nodded, slipping the envelope into her apron pocket. Thank you, she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure what for. Clint stood, adjusting his hat. He gave her one last look, the kind that spoke volumes without saying a word. Then, with the faintest of smiles, he tipped his hat and walked out of the diner, the bell above the door chiming softly in his wake. For a moment, Nina stood frozen, her mind racing with curiosity and disbelief. She retrieved the envelope from her pocket, her hands trembling slightly as she carefully opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a check. Her breath caught as she unfolded the note, her eyes scanning the words written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Dear Nina, for your daughter's music dreams, the world needs more people like you. Selfless, strong, and endlessly kind. Don't ever stop being who you are. Clint Eastwood. Her gaze shifted to the check, and her knees nearly buckled. The number staring back at her was $50,000. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. She clutched the note to her chest, her heart pounding as a rush of emotions overtook her. Gratitude, disbelief, hope, the weight of her struggles, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, all of it suddenly felt seen, acknowledged, and lifted, even if just for a moment. She thought of Ava, of her tiny hands pressing down on the keys of her toy keyboard, of the dreams Nina had feared might never come true. In that moment, standing in the quiet diner, Nina broke down. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, and of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, life had something brighter in store for her and Ava after all. The diner was quieter than usual the next morning, but a buzz of anticipation hummed through its walls. Word had begun to spread. Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, had not only dined there but left a gift so generous it felt like something out of a movie. It all started when Nina confided in her closest friend, Maria, who worked the night shift cleaning offices. "Maria, I have to tell you something," Nina had said, her voice trembling as they sat on Nina's small living room couch, Ava fast asleep in her bedroom. She handed Maria the letter and check, her hands shaking slightly. Maria's eyes widened as she read the note, her breath hitching when she saw the amount. "Nina, this is unbelievable," she exclaimed, her voice a mixture of awe and joy. "You've been blessed." Tears filled Nina's eyes again, her emotions still raw from the whirlwind of the past day. "I still can't believe it. I don't even know why he chose me." Maria reached over, squeezing Nina's hand tightly. "Because, my friend, you deserve it. People see your kindness, your strength. Even a man like Clint Eastwood couldn't miss that." The next morning, Maria couldn't keep the story to herself. She shared it with her cousin, who worked at the local bakery, and soon, the tale of Nina's quiet resilience and Clint's extraordinary gesture spread like wildfire through the town. By the end of the week, the diner was busier than ever, filled with locals and even a few curious visitors. Regulars stopped by just to offer Nina a kind word or a heartfelt congratulations. "People like you remind us there's good in the world, Nina," said Mrs. Peterson, a retired schoolteacher who lived down the street. Nina's coworkers rallied around her, offering to cover shifts so she could spend more time with Ava. The homeless man she had fed that day returned too, his clothes slightly cleaner, his eyes brighter. He handed Nina a small, hand-carved wooden trinket, a tiny piano. "I made this," he said shyly. "It's not much, but I just wanted to thank you." Nina held the little piano delicately, her throat tightening with emotion. "This means the world to me. Thank you." Inspired by Clint's generosity, Nina decided she couldn't keep all of the blessing to herself. She used part of the money to enroll Ava in proper piano lessons and buy her a second-hand upright piano. But she also reached out to the homeless man, offering to help him find a place to stay and a chance to get back on his feet. Her actions sparked a ripple effect throughout the community. Neighbors began organizing food drives and support programs for those in need. The local church even started a fund to help struggling families, naming it the Eastwood Fund, in honor of the man whose single act of kindness had inspired so much. And as Nina watched Ava press her tiny fingers against the keys of her new piano, the sound of hope filling their small home, she realized that Clint Eastwood's gift wasn't just money. It was a reminder of the power of humanity and the kindness that could transform lives. As Clint Eastwood sat in the quiet of his home, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls, his mind wandered back to that day at the diner. He thought of Nina, her determination etched into every move she made, her kindness so deeply ingrained that it seemed effortless. But the truth was, his gesture to her wasn't born from whim. It was a reflection of the lessons life had taught him, lessons that came flooding back in vivid detail. He leaned back in his chair, staring at an old photograph on the mantel, his mother, her face lined with resilience and a soft smile that never wavered, even during the hardest times. Clint closed his eyes, allowing the memories to envelop him. He was a boy again, no older than 10, standing in the kitchen of their modest home. His mother was bent over the stove, stirring a pot of soup that would have to stretch to feed them for the next 3 days. Despite the exhaustion on her face, she hummed a gentle tune, a melody that wrapped around Clint like a blanket. "Why do you still smile, Ma?" he had asked one evening, watching her pack up a small portion of their dinner to take to a neighbor who'd fallen on hard times. She had paused, her gaze meeting his. "Because, Clint, no matter how little we have, we can always share. Kindness doesn't cost anything, but it can mean the world to someone else." That lesson had stayed with him, shaping the man he would become. Through his years of fame, wealth, and success, Clint had never forgotten those days of struggle or the quiet strength of his mother's generosity. Opening his eyes, he glanced at the newspaper resting on the table beside him. A headline caught his attention: "Local Waitress inspires community after Hollywood star's generosity." He picked it up, his gaze lingering on the accompanying photo, a smiling Nina holding her daughter Ava beside the upright piano they had purchased. The article described how Nina had used part of the money to not only support her daughter's dreams, but also to uplift others in her community. A faint smile tugged at Clint's lips. He wasn't one to seek attention or dwell on his own deeds, but seeing the ripple effect of that single act filled him with quiet satisfaction. Nina hadn't just accepted the gift, She had multiplied it, proving that kindness, when shared, could grow beyond anyone's imagination. Clint set the newspaper down, his thoughts returning to that day at the diner. It had been an ordinary moment in many ways, yet extraordinary in its simplicity. A woman doing her best, a little girl with a spark of potential, and a chance to make a difference. He reached for his notebook and pen, scribbling a quick thought. Kindness begets kindness. It's not about recognition. It's about remembering where you came from and lifting others up along the way. As the fire crackled softly in the background, Clint felt at peace. For him, it was never about the grand gestures or the headlines. It was about the quiet, lasting impact of humanity, something his mother had taught him long ago, and something Nina now carried forward. The morning light streamed through the windows of Nina's small home, casting a golden glow across the modest living room. For the first time in what felt like years, Nina woke up without the crushing weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. Instead, there was a quiet hope, a budding confidence she hadn't known she could feel. Her days had taken on a new rhythm. Ava, now enrolled in professional music lessons, sat at their upright piano each evening, her small fingers dancing across the keys. The house was no longer filled with the silence of struggle. It resonated with melodies of possibility. Each note Ava played felt like a victory, a reminder of how far they had come. But Nina's transformation went deeper than the physical changes in her life. The gift from Clint Eastwood had been a spark, but the fire it lit was hers to tend. She began to see herself not as a woman barely getting by, but as someone with the power to create change. One evening, while Ava practiced a particularly challenging piece, Nina sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the syllabus of a part-time teaching course she had just enrolled in. Teaching had always been her dream, buried beneath years of survival and sacrifice. Now, she was finally taking the steps to make it a reality. Her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Maria. Maria, the Women's Center approved your proposal. They're so excited to have you lead the program. Nina smiled, her heart swelling with pride. A week earlier, she had pitched an idea to a local community center to start an initiative for struggling single mothers. It would provide resources, mentorship, and emotional support, things she wished she'd had during her darkest days. The idea had come to her late one night. As she reflected on Clint's note and his call to pass it on, she realized she couldn't just let her blessings stop with her and Ava. There were others out there, women like her, who needed a hand to hold, a voice of encouragement, a reminder that they weren't alone. The first meeting was scheduled for the following weekend. Nina spent her evenings preparing, gathering resources, and crafting a speech that she hoped would inspire the women who attended. She wanted them to feel the way she had when she read Clint's note, as if the impossible were within reach. Ava wandered into the kitchen, her face glowing with excitement. "Mom, listen to this," she said, pulling her mother toward the piano. She played a piece she had been practicing for days, her fingers moving with newfound confidence and grace. When the last note lingered in the air, Nina clapped, her eyes misting with tears. "That was beautiful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Ava beamed. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom." Nina knelt beside her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace. "And I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. As they sat there, the piano's warm notes still echoing softly, Nina felt it. Her life wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about growth, connection, and the chance to help others find their way, just as she had. A new chapter had begun, and it was only the start of something extraordinary. The evening was perfect, crisp, clear, and alive with a quiet sense of possibility. The small community auditorium buzzed with anticipation as families and friends filed in, taking their seats. At the front, a gleaming piano stood waiting under a soft spotlight, a symbol of dreams taking shape. Nina sat in the second row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked at Ava, who was adjusting her dress on the small stage, her face a mix of nervousness and excitement. Nina's heart swelled with pride. This moment, so simple yet monumental, was the culmination of not just Ava's hard work, but of an unbroken chain of kindness that had started months ago with Clint Eastwood's unexpected note. The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the room. Ava took her place on the piano bench, her tiny hands poised over the keys. She looked out into the crowd, her gaze finding Nina's. A confident smile spread across her face and she began to play. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a piece Ava had chosen for its emotion and complexity. Each note resonated deeply, weaving a story that spoke to everyone in the room, a story of struggle, hope, and triumph. As the final notes lingered in the air, the audience erupted into applause. Ava stood, bowing gracefully, her cheeks flushed with pride. She picked up the microphone placed nearby and spoke, her voice clear and steady despite her age. "This performance is dedicated to my mom," Ava said, her gaze finding Nina again. "She's my hero, and everything I do is because of her strength and love." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "And to the kind man who believed in us, even when we couldn't believe in ourselves. Thank you." Tears streamed down Nina's face as the audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. It was a standing ovation not just for Ava's performance, but for the journey that had brought them all to this moment. After the recital, people lingered in the lobby, sharing stories and offering congratulations. Many approached Nina, thanking her for inspiring the community with her resilience and generosity. One woman, holding her young son's hand, said, "You've shown us that it doesn't take much to change lives, just kindness and a little courage. Thank you, Nina." As Nina drove home that night, with Ava fast asleep in the back seat, she couldn't stop reflecting on how far they had come. Clint Eastwood's act of kindness hadn't just changed her life, it had set off a ripple effect that had touched countless others. The women's center she'd started was thriving, offering hope and resources to single mothers in the area. Ava's piano lessons were progressing beautifully, and she had dreams of one day teaching music to children who couldn't afford lessons. And Nina? She was no longer just surviving, she was thriving. She had become a symbol of hope in her community, proof that even the smallest acts of kindness could create waves of change. As she tucked Ava into bed that night, she whispered, "We're going to keep this kindness alive, Ava. We'll keep sharing it, just like he wanted." And in that quiet moment, Nina knew this was only the beginning of a legacy of kindness, a legacy that proved humanity's potential to rise above and create something extraordinary. Kindness has the power to transform lives, spark hope, and inspire change. Nina and Ava's story reminds us that no matter how small an act of generosity may seem, its impact can ripple far beyond what we imagine. Now it's your turn to make a difference. Take a moment to show kindness today, whether it's lending a helping hand, offering a kind word, or supporting someone in need. You have the power to uplift others and create a world where compassion thrives. Let's keep the ripple of kindness alive. Share this story, inspire others, and take action. Together, we can build a brighter, more compassionate world.